My name is Anna Mitchell, and the letter arrived on a Thursday evening just as the sun was bleeding out over the Austin skyline, turning my small apartment into a box of fading orange light. It was not an email, not a voicemail, not even a text. It was a folded envelope slid under my door. My father's handwriting scrawled across the front in his blunt mechanical strokes that had once signed paychecks and loan agreements with the same indifference. I hesitated before picking it up, my stomach already tightening because I knew in my bones that nothing good ever came in his handwriting. The paper smelled faintly of stale coffee, and the corner was smudged as if his thumb had pressed too hard when sealing it. Inside, just 12 words. "Don't try coming to the family reunion. You are not welcome." I read it once, then again, expecting the second time to trigger some rush of emotion, some explosion of grief or anger or even relief. But all I felt was stillness, the same stillness that settles in the air right before a storm splits the sky open. My father had finally said out loud what his silence had been whispering for years. I was cut out. I was not a daughter, not an heir, not even a participant in the illusion of family. I stared at those words until the lines blurred. My hands didn't tremble. My chest didn't heave. Instead, a strange calm washed over me like the quiet breath you take before diving into cold water. For years, I had been waiting for this moment without knowing it, bracing for the inevitable confirmation that I was never meant to belong. And now, here it was, sealed in ink. I took my phone, scrolled to his contact, and typed 2 words. Understood. No more, no less. No questions, no begging, no anger. Just a reply that carried the weight of everything I had endured and everything I was about to do. As my thumb pressed send, I felt a pulse inside me. Not pain, not fear, but something sharper, steadier, like the sound of a lock clicking shut. Outside my window, the last strip of daylight collapsed into night, and the city lights began to flicker awake. For the first time in my life, silence did not mean submission. It meant strategy. That letter was supposed to end me, to exile me from the only community I had ever known. But it was also my release. They thought they were cutting me off. What they did not realize was that they had just freed me. My father's letter was not the end of my story. It was the opening line of the chapter where I stopped being invisible and started becoming dangerous. My name is Anna Mitchell. I am 29 years old, and I work as an accountant in Austin, Texas. That may sound like an ordinary life, a woman with a degree in finance and a modest apartment with one window facing the downtown skyline. But every detail of how I got here is rooted in the family that now tells me I am no longer welcome. I was born into the Mitchell family business, a chain of construction supply warehouses built from a small garage by my grandfather and expanded by my father Richard. From the moment I could count change at the register, I was told I was useful only because I could keep the numbers straight. My brother Mark, 3 years older, was celebrated as the heir, the future leader, the one who carried the Mitchell name with pride. At school events, my parents clapped for his trophies. At home, they told me to finish the bookkeeping before dinner. When I landed my first internship with a private accounting firm, my mother smiled politely but quickly asked if I had time to check the family payroll. When I bought my first used car with money I had saved myself, my father barely looked up, muttering that a daughter should not worry about wheels when she should be preparing to support her brother's empire. It was always the same. Mark was golden. I was invisible. The golden child and the responsible child. The son who could do no wrong and the daughter who could never do enough. The older I grew, the clearer it became that my worth to them was not measured in love or pride, but in how much responsibility I could shoulder quietly. If Mark overspent, I had to adjust the books. If my father wanted a new loan, I was forced to sign as co-signer because, according to him, daughters exist to guarantee stability. There were no thank yous, no acknowledgments, only the steady refrain that family comes first, and that meant the men of the family first. I know many of you watching this have lived through something similar. Maybe not in a construction supply business, maybe not with million-dollar loans, but with parents or siblings who decided your role was to sacrifice while someone else basked in the spotlight. If you have ever been overlooked, if you have ever been treated like your silence was your duty, leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I want to know if you have stood where I stand, because that letter was not an isolated insult. It was the final punctuation mark at the end of a long history written in unfairness and favoritism. I tell you this not for pity, but so you can see clearly why two words understood carried so much weight. They were not the words of a daughter defeated. They were the words of a woman who had decided she would no longer play invisible. For years, I was the quiet accountant in the background of the Mitchell legacy. But quiet does not mean powerless and invisible, does not mean incapable. What my father never understood is that the skills he dismissed in me, the long hours with ledgers, the sleepless nights reconciling accounts, the financial discipline he mocked as pointless, those were the very tools that would undo the empire he tried to lock me out of. That is why the story begins with a letter and a calm reply, but it does not end there. The real story is how I took their attempt to erase me and turned it into my liberation. I was 12 the first time I realized the rules of our household were not the same for me as they were for Mark. It was a hot July afternoon, Texas heat pressing against the window screens, the smell of dust and cut lumber drifting from the yard where my father stored pallets of building supplies. Mark was outside, tossing a football with our cousins, while my mother handed out lemonade and applause like he was already a quarterback destined for the big leagues. I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of receipts so high they tipped when I brushed against them, a sharpened pencil in my hand, and sweat sticking to my back as I tried to balance the numbers that no adult seemed to want to touch. My father walked in, glanced at the chaos of paper, and nodded approvingly. Not at me, but at the fact that the receipts were being handled at all. He did not say, "Good job, Anna." He said, "Keep it neat. Your brother needs a clear path when he steps in someday." That was the first time I felt the sting of invisibility, the sense that my work mattered only as scaffolding for Mark's future. At 16, when most girls I knew were thinking about prom dresses or summer jobs at the mall, I was standing behind the counter of our family warehouse, calculating payroll on a calculator with buttons so worn the numbers had faded. I remember the smell of grease from forklifts and the sound of Mark laughing as he sped away in the truck our father bought him for his birthday. My own birthday gift that year was an old adding machine my father tossed onto my desk with the words, "You'll need this more than you'll need lipstick." I smiled tightly because what else could I do, but inside I felt a bruise form that would never quite fade. At 18, I applied for college with a major in accounting. My acceptance letter arrived, and I remember clutching it with trembling hands, thinking for once they would be proud. Instead, my father frowned, worried out loud about who would keep the family numbers straight if I went off chasing degrees. "You're a daughter, Anna," he said. "Your job is to keep the home strong, not to waste time proving yourself." Still, I went. I worked nights at a diner to pay tuition, pouring coffee for truckers until dawn, then stumbling into 8 a.m. classes with eyes so tired they burned. Every paycheck went to books rent, and sometimes back home, when my mother called claiming the company was short on payroll again. At 20, I was summoned home for what my father called a serious family responsibility. He sat me down in the office that smelled of dust and ink and pushed a stack of papers across the desk. It was a loan agreement, $1.8 million. His voice was calm, commanding. "Sign here, Anna. We need you as a co-signer." I stared at the numbers, my stomach hollow, my hands clammy. "Dad," I said, "I don't even own anything. What happens if this fails?" He glared at me as if I had spoken treason. "Family doesn't ask what happens if. Family does what is needed. You're a daughter. Your role is to guarantee stability." Mark was sitting right there, leaning back with his feet on another chair, grinning like it was a game. He did not sign. I did. My pen scratched across the paper, and in that moment a chain tightened around my neck, invisible but unyielding. The years that followed blurred into a rhythm of sacrifice. I worked internships during the day, audited courses at night, and every spare hour was spent reconciling our company's ledgers. When money went missing, I adjusted the accounts. When invoices were late, I drove across town to chase signatures. Mark, meanwhile, played golf with potential clients, drank expensive whiskey, and crashed cars my father would immediately replace. At 22, I finally graduated, the first in our family to earn a degree, but instead of celebration, my father handed me another folder of financial statements and said, "Good, now you can apply it where it counts." I moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment, but half my weekends were swallowed by the company office, windowless and heavy with the scent of printer toner. There was no paycheck for me, only the guilt trip that family loyalty should be payment enough. I bought groceries for my parents with my own wages, filled my mother's fridge when I visited, and never saw a single thank you note. Every time I asked about boundaries, I was reminded Mark will carry the business forward. Your job is to support. At 24, my father called me home again. Another loan, this one for $2.5 million. This time, he did not even pretend to explain. He pushed the papers at me, his tone final. You will sign. It was not a request. I signed, but inside, something began to shift. It was not rebellion yet, but a quiet ticking awareness that my future was being mortgaged without my consent. My friends from college were buying cars, planning weddings, some even buying small homes. I was sitting in a dim office, stamping checks I would never cash, signing liabilities that could crush me. Listening to my father remind me I was lucky to be needed. I began to notice the patterns more clearly. Mark made mistakes, my father cleaned them up. I carried burdens, my father called it duty. My mother stood in the corner silent, her eyes darting away when mine begged for support. The narrative of our family was written in bold letters across every action: sons inherit, daughters absorb. That truth etched itself into my bones and followed me like a shadow. Each sacrifice stacked upon the last until my back bent under the weight of them. But even shadows can shift when the light changes, and by the time I turned 25, I had started to wonder how long I could endure being invisible before I disappeared completely. By the time I was 25, I was working full-time as the de facto accountant for Mitchell Supply, though my father never once called me that or paid me a salary that matched the hours. He called it helping the family, as if the countless spreadsheets and reconciliations I handled were no different from washing dishes after dinner. I sat in an office the size of a closet, walls lined with dusty binders, the hum of an old fluorescent light buzzing like an insect above my head. Every morning I opened QuickBooks and found another mess to clean. Vendors were being overpaid, invoices were duplicated, charges appeared for services that did not exist. I traced the entries back and realized they all led to accounts Mark controlled. When I confronted my father, his face hardened into that granite mask he used when delivering ultimatums. Do not make trouble, Anna. These are business adjustments. Your brother knows what he is doing. My voice rose trembling but steady. Dad, these are fraudulent. We could be audited. We could lose everything. He slammed his fist on the desk, papers flying like startled birds. Enough. You are a daughter. You keep quiet. This is not your concern. Mark leaned in the doorway behind him, smirking like he had won before I even opened my mouth. He held a tumbler of bourbon, though it was barely noon, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his confidence oozing entitlement. Relax, sis, he said. Invoices are just numbers on paper. You worry too much. And then he walked away laughing. My cheeks burned, but I said nothing more because what was the use? A week later, my father summoned me again. The office smelled of stale smoke from his cigar, a haze lingering in the air. Another stack of papers waited for me on the desk. A new loan this time for $3.2 million. The bank required a co-signer, and once again my father slid the line toward me. You will sign. His tone brooked no argument. I stared at the figures, the columns of debt that could ruin me for life. My heart thudded in my ears. Dad, I whispered, I cannot keep doing this. He leaned forward, eyes cold. You can and you will. Family comes first. Mark sat across the room, scrolling his phone, barely pretending to listen. He did not have to sign. He never had to. All the risk fell on me, the responsible one, the invisible one. The daughter. I signed, the ink bleeding into paper like another piece of my soul draining away. As the pen left the page, a thought struck me with sudden clarity. I was not a daughter to them. I was collateral. I was the human shield protecting Mark from consequences, the insurance policy my father wielded without hesitation. They did not love me. They used me. Every sacrifice I had made, every night I worked through exhaustion, every dollar I poured back into the household, none of it earned respect. It only confirmed their belief that I was meant to absorb the damage so the sun could shine. That night, I lay awake in my apartment staring at the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the walls. I heard Mark's laughter echo in my mind, my father's fist on the desk. my mother's silence like a ghost hovering in the corner, the weight of $3.2 million pressed against my chest like a stone. For the first time, I felt not just invisible, but endangered. I was not being overlooked. I was being sacrificed, and the realization left a metallic taste in my mouth, bitter and sharp. I knew something had to change, though I did not yet know how. What I did know with bone-deep certainty was that if I continued down this path, I would disappear entirely, consumed by debts and duties that were never mine to bear. The injustice was no longer background noise. It was a siren screaming in my head, demanding action. The night after I signed the $3.2 million loan, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of copied invoices and a cheap secondhand laptop glowing against the dark. My apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren 2 blocks away. I spread the papers out like a puzzle, highlighting duplicate charges tracing payments to shell vendors that shared the same P.O. box. The patterns were obvious to me, glaring red flags that anyone with basic training could see, but no one else cared to look. I opened a new spreadsheet and began recording everything line by line, date by date, vendor by vendor. I called it my shadow ledger. For months, I built it in secret, each entry a small rebellion, each line a seed of proof. I knew I was risking discovery. If my father saw the files, he would call me disloyal. If Mark found them, he would laugh and delete everything. But keeping it hidden gave me a strange thrill, a spark of control in a life where control had always been denied to me. At work, I wore the mask of dutiful daughter, nodding when told to sign, biting my tongue when told to stay silent. At night, I became something else, the quiet collector of evidence. Around that time, I reconnected with Laura, a friend from college who had gone on to law school. We met for coffee in a small cafe, tucked between an insurance office and a laundromat, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans. She looked at me across the table, eyes sharp behind her glasses, and asked how things were at home. The words tumbled out of me before I could stop them, stories of loans and forged invoices of a father who saw me as a co-signer first, and a daughter second of a brother shielded from consequences by my signature. Laura listened, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. Finally, she said, "Anna, silence can be a weapon if you learn how to wield it. You have more power than you think." She explained something I had not known. As a co-signer, I had the right to withdraw my liability under certain conditions by filing an affidavit with the bank. It would not erase the debt, but it would separate me from it. My pulse quickened as I scribbled notes on a napkin. For the first time, there was a path, a crack in the wall of inevitability that had surrounded me all my life. Laura warned me to be careful. If you act, do it quietly. Paperwork can be louder than shouting if filed at the right moment. I went home that evening with my heart hammering the shadow ledger heavy in my bag like contraband. Weeks passed and my file grew. I collected copies of wire transfers, cross-checked vendor addresses, even snapped photos of Mark's emails left open when he staggered away from his desk drunk. The more I found, the clearer the picture became. My family was not just sloppy, they were corrupt. And the corruption was feeding off my silence. Then came the announcement. My father called a meeting not with me alone, but with extended relatives. The Mitchell family reunion, he declared, would be held at our warehouse banquet hall in 2 months. 50 people would come, cousins, uncles, old friends. It was to be both a celebration of legacy and, though he did not say it aloud, a coronation for Mark. I knew the pattern too well. There would be speeches about heritage, about bloodlines, about sons carrying the torch. There would be no mention of the daughter who signed loans, who balanced books, who worked until her eyes blurred. It would be my erasure, public and final. But as I listened to him outline the event, my shadow ledger hidden in the drawer of my desk, another thought rose within me like a steady flame. If they wanted to make a show of control, I could make a show of truth. They thought they were building a stage to crown Mark. What they did not know was that they were also building the perfect stage for me to dismantle the empire from within. The night I decided to act, the city was hushed under a thin drizzle, raindrops streaking my apartment window like veins of silver. I sat at my desk, the shadow ledger open in front of me, my laptop casting a pale glow across the room. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, trembling not from fear but from the weight of what I was about to do. For years, I had signed papers handed to me, my name inked beneath debts that were not mine, my identity shackled to obligations I never chose. Tonight would be different. Tonight, I would sign my own name on my own terms. I opened the bank portal, the familiar login screen blinking like a gatekeeper. My heart pounded as I typed my credentials, each keystroke echoing in my chest. The page loaded slowly, painfully, as if testing my resolve. Then the dashboard appeared, columns of numbers, outstanding balances, loan agreements with my name neatly listed under cosigner. I clicked on the affidavit template Laura had sent me, filled in the lines with careful precision, my handwriting crisp on the digital form. Withdrawal of liability, effective immediately. I attached the required documents, my ID, my prior signature, every proof the bank could demand. My breath hitched as I hovered over the submit button. For a moment, I thought of my father's voice, sharp and commanding, telling me daughters must be silent. I thought of Mark's laughter, careless and cruel, echoing through hallways I had cleaned of their messes. I thought of my mother's eyes darting away in cowardice. And then I pressed enter. The screen refreshed, a message appeared. Submission received. A quiet chime sounded from my laptop speakers, small and ordinary, but to me it was thunder. My name was no longer chained to their empire. I leaned back in my chair, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but they were not tears of grief. They were the release of years of restraint, the breaking of a dam. I was free, at least in part, but I was not finished. I opened a new email addressed not to my family, but to the independent auditor whose contact Laura had given me. I wrote no explanation, no accusations. I simply attached the shadow ledger, page after page of fraudulent invoices, duplicate payments, offshore transfers, screenshots of emails dripping with arrogance. The subject line was a single word: review. I hit send, the whoosh of the email leaving my outbox sounding louder than any shout I had ever dared in that household. Then silence. Heavy, deliberate silence. I shut the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the rain ease into a patter. I did not call Laura to boast. I did not pour a drink to celebrate. I let the quiet fill me because quiet was my weapon now. For years, they had mistaken my silence for weakness. Tonight, it was strategy sharp and exact. The irony did not escape me. My father had spent decades telling me to hold my tongue, to stay invisible. And now invisibility was the cloak I wore as I dismantled his kingdom. No one saw me act, no one heard me move. Yet the ground beneath them was already shifting. I glanced at the calendar on my wall. The family reunion was less than a week away. 50 relatives would gather to celebrate legacy, to crown Mark as heir. They thought it would be their triumph. They had no idea it would be their undoing. The stage was built, the audience assembled, the spotlight ready. And I, the daughter they had declared unwelcome, had just ensured that when the curtain rose, it would not be applause they received. It would be reckoning. The Mitchell family reunion was held in the warehouse banquet hall, a cavernous space that smelled faintly of varnish and grilled meat strung with cheap fairy lights that flickered against the steel beams. Long tables groaned under trays of food. Laughter rolled through the air, and every conversation seemed to orbit around one figure, my brother Mark. He wore a tailored suit that gleamed under the lights, his smile wide and careless as he shook hands, slapped backs, and basked in the attention of uncles and cousins who had always called him the Golden Boy. My father stood at the head of the room, stern and proud, his silver hair slicked back, a whiskey glass in his hand, as though he were a king preparing to anoint his heir. My mother hovered behind him, her eyes darting nervously, never meeting mine, though she knew I was there. I had walked in alone, wearing a simple black dress, my shoulders squared, my face unreadable. No one expected me. They had assumed the letter had done its work, that I would slink away in humiliation. The whispers began the moment I stepped through the door. Why is she here? Didn't Richard tell her not to come? I did not flinch. I took a seat near the back, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. My father raised his glass and cleared his throat. "Family," he began. "Tonight we celebrate legacy, tradition, and the future of Mitchell Supply." He gestured toward Mark, who puffed out his chest like a prize stallion. "Mark will be stepping into greater responsibility. He will carry our name forward with strength and vision." Applause erupted, forks clattered against plates, and Mark grinned as if the crown had already been placed on his head. That was the moment my phone buzzed. A number flashed across the screen, the bank's area code. I answered, my voice steady, though my pulse quickened. "This is Ms. Mitchell." The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Ms. Mitchell, we are calling to inform you that your affidavit has been processed. Your liability as co-signer is withdrawn, effective immediately. Additionally, due to irregularities reported, the accounts associated with the loan have been frozen pending investigation." I murmured thank you and ended the call. Silence spread through the table around me as if the air itself had shifted. My father's phone buzzed next. He glanced at it, frowned, then answered. His face drained of color as he listened. Mark leaned in confusion, creasing his forehead. Then came the explosion. "What do you mean frozen? What do you mean investigation?" My father's voice thundered across the hall, silencing every conversation. All eyes turned toward him, then toward me, as realization dawned. He slammed his glass onto the table, shards scattering. "You!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You did this! You betrayed us!" Mark stood, his suit jacket wrinkling as he jabbed a finger in my direction. "After everything we gave you, you dare ruin us!" I rose slowly, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor echoing like a drum. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of the affidavit stamped and sealed, and printouts of the emails I had sent to the auditor. I placed them on the nearest table, the papers crisp under the fluorescent light. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. My words cut through the silence with surgical precision. "For years you told me to stay silent. Tonight my silence spoke louder than your shouting. I have withdrawn from your debts. I have revealed your fraud. You built this empire on control and lies. I will not be your collateral anymore." Gasps rippled through the crowd. An uncle stepped closer to squint at the papers. A cousin whispered to another. My father's face contorted with fury, veins bulging in his neck. My mother covered her mouth, her eyes wide with something between fear and shame. Mark shouted incoherently, words tumbling over each other, but no one was listening to him anymore. The focus was on me, the daughter they had called invisible, the woman they had tried to erase with a letter. I straightened my back, looked directly at my father, and delivered the final blow. "You told me I was nothing. You told me I did not belong. But it is your kingdom that is collapsing, not mine. My silence ended your reign." The hall erupted, not in applause, not in support, but in chaos. Relatives muttered, some drifting away from my father, others shaking their heads at Mark. The fairy lights flickered above us as if mocking the scene. My father sagged into his chair, his face pale, his hand shaking around the empty glass. Mark tried to rally, shouting that I was lying, that this was all a mistake, but the weight of the documents on the table spoke louder than any of his protests. I gathered my folder, turned without waiting for permission, and walked out into the cool night. The air smelled of rain and asphalt. My heels clicked against the pavement as behind me the family reunion dissolved into shouts and recriminations. For the first time, I felt taller than the building I left behind. My silence had ended their noise, and as I stepped into the darkness, I knew the empire that had thrived on my obedience was already crumbling piece by piece under the weight of the truth I had unleashed. The morning after the reunion, I woke to 3 missed calls and a string of voicemails. My phone buzzed relentlessly on the nightstand, but I let it ring until the silence returned. When I finally listened, the messages came like waves crashing against rock. My father's voice, first hoarse with fury. "You ungrateful child, do you know what you have done? You have destroyed everything. The bank will ruin us." Then, Mark, his tone shrill with panic. "Fix this! Anna, withdraw. Whatever you filed, you cannot leave us hanging like this. You are family, whether you like it or not." And finally, my mother, her voice trembling. "Anna, please, you know your father is proud. He did not mean it. We can work this out. Just come home." I deleted them one by one, my thumb steady. The world outside was already moving. News spread quickly in business circles. By midweek, an independent auditor had descended on the warehouse, combing through records matching my shadow ledger to their books. Accounts were frozen. Vendors began pulling out, unwilling to risk association. Employees whispered in corners, sensing the storm. For decades, Mitchell Supply had stood as a symbol of stability in our community, but now cracks were visible to everyone. I drove past the main warehouse one evening and saw my father standing outside, phone pressed to his ear. His shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen. Mark stormed past him, gesturing wildly, his suit jacket flapping as though even fabric refused to stay aligned with him. They looked smaller, diminished, stripped of the arrogance that had once filled every room. Rumors reached me through old colleagues. The bank had flagged not just the recent loan, but prior agreements. Investigators were asking questions about offshore transfers. Vendors demanded explanations for inflated invoices. My father's credit rating plummeted. Lines of credit evaporated overnight. What they had built on control was collapsing under exposure. And I, the invisible daughter, was no longer carrying the weight. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking to the phantom sound of calculators and signatures. Yet I did not feel triumph, at least not in the way I imagined. What I felt was clarity. Justice does not always roar like a crowd. Sometimes it lingers, echoing in empty warehouses, in unanswered calls, in the silence that follows when control is stripped away. One evening, Laura came by with takeout cartons of noodles steaming between us. She asked if I regretted it. I shook my head. No, I said, they wrote me out long ago. All I did was underline the truth. She raised her chopsticks in a toast. To silence as a weapon. I clinked mine against hers, the steam fogging the window beside us. In the days that followed, the messages from my family shifted. Rage softened into desperation. My father's voice cracked, pleading for me to reconsider. Mark promised I would be reinstated, that we could share the future if only I withdrew my affidavit. My mother sobbed, whispering that she could not bear to watch the family fall apart. But I had already chosen. I replayed the words in my mind, steady and unwavering. Justice doesn't scream, it echoes. Their downfall was not the sound of me shouting. It was the sound of me refusing to answer, of me stepping aside and letting the truth crash through the walls they built. On the final day of the month, I received an official letter from the bank, stamped and sealed. Confirmation, my liability was fully withdrawn, my name no longer tied to their debts. I held the paper in my hands, the ink crisp, the seal raised beneath my fingertips. For once, it was not a burden. It was liberation. I slipped it into a folder labeled New Life and placed it in my desk. Outside, the city hummed with ordinary life. But for me, the echoes of justice were still reverberating, steady and unrelenting, a sound my family would hear long after the last voicemail faded into silence. Months passed after the reunion, and the echoes of that night still lingered in the corners of my mind, not as nightmares, but as reminders that silence can transform into strength. I moved into a loft on the east side of Austin, its brick walls scarred but solid sunlight pouring through tall windows each morning as if to declare that every day was a clean page. I furnished it with care, secondhand shelves stacked with books on finance and resilience, a sturdy desk where I could spread papers without fear of someone snatching them away. From that desk, I built something new. Not a company based on bloodlines and control, but a consulting practice designed to help women-led startups navigate finances with clarity and independence. My first clients were two sisters launching a catering business, their hands stained with flour, their eyes bright with determination. They paid me modestly, but thanked me profusely, their gratitude filling a space in my heart that my family never had. Soon word spread, and more women arrived, each with a dream too fragile to risk mismanagement, each trusting me with the numbers that could either sink or save them. For the first time, my skills were not invisible. They were valued. One afternoon, the mail arrived with an envelope from the bank, its logo embossed, its contents precise. Inside was a final confirmation letter stamped and signed, declaring that my liability was fully withdrawn, that I bore no further responsibility for the Mitchell debts. I held it in my hands, the paper cool, the ink crisp, and felt a quiet surge of victory. I slipped it into a folder I had labeled New Life, the contrast striking against the bulging folder labeled Shadow Ledger that still sat in my drawer. The old life had been about survival. The new life was about choice. Occasionally, my phone still buzzed with numbers I recognized but no longer answered. I listened once to a voicemail from my father, his voice cracked softer than I had ever heard. "Anna, please, we cannot do this without you." For a moment, I almost pitied him, but then I remembered the years of being used as collateral, the endless sacrifices dismissed as duty, the letter telling me I was unwelcome. I deleted the message. My mother's silence spoke louder than any plea could have. She had chosen her place long ago, standing behind my father, bowing to his rules. Mark's messages were less restrained, swinging between threats and desperation, his arrogance unraveling with each word. They were no longer my burden. One evening, I sat with Laura on the rooftop of my building, the city lights glittering below takeout cartons between us. She raised a glass and said, "To the girl who turned silence into a sword." I laughed, the sound carrying into the night. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was a woman who had carved her own path. The family I had lost was never truly mine. The family I chose was built of friends, clients, and strangers who saw my worth without demanding sacrifice. That was enough. And so the story that began with a letter meant to exile me ended with a letter that liberated me. My father wrote, "Don't try coming." I replied, "Understood." What he did not understand was that those two words were not surrender. They were a declaration. I understood that I would no longer be collateral. I understood that I had the power to walk away, and I understood that justice does not always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives quietly in affidavits filed in accounts frozen in the calm breath of a woman who refuses to disappear. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been told your role was to stay silent while others took the spotlight, know this. Silence can destroy you if you let it, but if you learn to wield it, silence can also set you free. If my story resonates with you, leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that being overlooked does not mean being powerless. We are not difficult. We are not burdens. We are simply becoming visible. And once visible, we cannot be erased. In the end, this story is not just about betrayal or broken trust. It is about the quiet strength we carry when the world tells us we are invisible. Many of you watching may know what it feels like to be overlooked, to be told your role is only to sacrifice to stay silent while others take the credit. But silence, when chosen with purpose, can become a shield and even a sword. Justice does not always roar in the courtroom or thunder across headlines. Sometimes it arrives in small, steady actions, in a signature withheld, in an affidavit filed, in the courage to walk away. For those of you over 50 who have lived through years of giving more than you received, I want you to hear this clearly. Your worth is not defined by the people who ignored it. It is defined by the dignity with which you reclaim it. If my story touched you, please take a moment to hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. This community is not just about stories, it is about chosen family, and here, your voice will always matter.